Welcome, everybody, to another edition of Steps Run's NBA podcast. This is episode 436 of the podcast. I'm Drew Dinkmeyer in the host chair today as Mike Gallagher is 1-2-3 Cancun on his way to the All-Star break and some much deserved time off. I'm going to be joined by Saum Jafarinia today to talk through new faces, new places, an early review of some of the players that were moved at the trade deadline and what we've seen in the first few games in their new threads. With me, Saum Jafarinia, to talk through it. Saum, how are you doing today?
I'm great. It's awesome to be joining you on the pod. A lot of interesting situations we get to talk through after getting a sneak peek on some of these trades. And big shout out to Mike, getting his vacation started and ready to go.
Yeah, and it's nice. Mike gets to take off to Mexico, enjoy the break a little bit. We got one more slate of games to work our way through, and then we get a little bit of a break. But let's check in on some of these big trades and kind of what we've seen for the first few games here. Let's start with Luka Doncic and the Lakers. Lakers 1-1 in their first two games with Luka here. Saum, I know the Lakers are close to your heart as a Lakers fan. What have your initial reactions been to life without Anthony Davis, with Luka Doncic and the new look Lakers?
Yeah, and coming off the Mark Williams trade getting rescinded, been quite an interesting week with all the chaos and everything. But yeah, early reviews. We've got two games, both against Utah, both blowouts. We haven't seen Luka play a ton in either of these games, but early returns have been pretty nice. I mean, Luka's shown a little bit of rust. He obviously hasn't played in a while, but there's a lot of times in these games you see these moments where you really see the vision of just the LeBron Luka pairing and how special it can be in moments. And now, speaking on that Mark Williams trade, I think the team right now is constructed. I don't want to say it's flawed, but maybe incomplete, a better word, where they're just really down with the center position, where they're starting Jackson Hayes, and we saw he leaves early last game, and then Alex Len, who had just kind of been riding the Kings bench for a while. He thought he was going to the Pacers, and the Lakers signed him, and now he's starting the second half. So a lot of questions, I think, coming out of this All-Star break around the involvement of the team, but early returns, you can really see why this relationship with Luka and LeBron could be so positive.
Yeah, and we hadn't recorded a podcast since the Mark Williams trade had been rescinded. So that's a good opening point. I think one of the things that Mike and I were so excited about for the Lakers after the trade deadline was that they had sort of done both ends of the spectrum in terms of building that bridge for the future when LeBron ultimately moves on, whenever that happens. If it does, he's certainly shown no signs of slowing down, that they have Luka Doncic to kind of be that next bridge, but also remaining competitive right now in terms of a complete roster with the center position kind of filled out there with Mark Williams to potentially be a threat in the Western Conference. I think without that Mark Williams trade, it certainly leaves them a lot thinner. We know that Luka Doncic can elevate centers from the offensive end of the spectrum. And we saw that very early in the first game with Jackson Hayes, as the first two baskets of the game were lobs from Luka and from LeBron. But ultimately, on the defensive side of the ball, there's going to be these question marks. And there were certainly going to be those question marks with Mark Williams there regardless. But the hope was on the rebounding side that you could at least skew some of those. Now I think there's some more legitimate question marks about what the Lakers are going to look like for the rest of the season, because that center position is going to be difficult to fill. I think ultimately what they might need to get to is Jared Vanderbilt at the center spot. We'll see if they're able to get that. But Jackson Hayes and Jared Vanderbilt kind of taking on the bulk of the center spot. LeBron and Rui taking on the bulk of the four spot. They're going to need to build out production from the guard spot to be able to do that. They've gotten a nice contribution so far from Jordan Goodwin, who they've brought in on a short-term contract. It looks like he is potentially an answer to add some of that guard depth to them. But I would say for the first two games, for me, what I've seen from Luka Doncic, you mentioned the rust. That's definitely been there. There's been less of a ball handling role than I expected early on. So it'll be interesting to see how that ball handling role shifts between Luka, Austin Reeves, and LeBron James. So far, it's been less Luka dominant than I expected, which is also part of the reason that the production is a little bit light for him. So on the offensive side, you mentioned you do see those glimpses, though. You see the glimpses of the ability to play make and the ability to get the ball kind of quickly up the floor for LeBron James, also to work in transition in the ways that he's now able to with a look-ahead passer in the form of Luka Doncic that can rebound and kind of outlet. His ability to move off ball and cut, I think, are going to be very, very strong suits for this offense. And I think ultimately we're going to get to a point where the ball is in Luka's hands a lot more. LeBron is operating a little bit more off ball. Austin Reeves operating a little bit more as a floor spacer, and Luka sort of creating with the verticality of a Jackson Hayes or a Jared Vanderbilt with LeBron kind of doing cuts, backdoor cuts, working kind of that way and challenging the defense there, and the stretched out defense from the spacing from Rui Hachimura and Austin Reeves. I think that's where we're eventually going to get. We've seen glimpses of it so far, but I think the big concerns are ultimately like on the defensive side. And I don't know that there's good solutions there. So I think going forward, we're going to see the Lakers in a lot of high scoring shootout type affairs. And I think from a DFS, from a fantasy perspective, we're going to be wanting to invest in these games, most likely on the other side of the Lakers, because I think they're going to elevate other teams. And they've been on this great defensive run prior to this without Anthony Davis, with Jackson Hayes playing really, really well. But I think introducing Luka into the mix, I think relying too much on Jackson Hayes is going to be challenging there. So, Saum, as a Lakers fan, where or how do you think they can close some of these gaps that we're expecting them to have defensively?
Yeah, I think you bring up a great point with the defense, where in the last month, I mean, they've really stepped it up and been one of the top teams. That's really what's propelled them to this, this really great streak they've had before last game. Obviously getting blown up by Utah, but before that, it had been all roses and everything. And getting to that defensive point where we're really behind Jackson Hayes right now. You have Jared Vanderbilt, and eventually the hope is Maxi Kleber comes back, but he's going to be out for a while. But in the playoffs, we've seen Vanderbilt and Kleber, they've had their issues where we especially saw in the finals last year with Kleber, where theoretically, he was supposed to be good in that Boston matchup where he could switch a lot with that kind of 5-out way Boston plays. But he was just such a zero on offense that it was really, really hard to put him out there. And we've seen Jared Vanderbilt in the past get played off in the playoffs as well with just that kind of issue. When his shots aren't falling and he's just not enough of an offensive threat, it can bring issues. Now, how much is the Luka boom on offense going to be able to make up for, the defensive liabilities they're going to have? We'll see. But that's really, I think, going to be the big question, is how much, of a boost on offense you're going to get to make up for what we assume is going to be kind of lost on defense.
Yeah, and we kind of forget about the Maxi Kleber part of that acquisition as well. Good note there. He has been that role defensively in the past, but it's actually a role that I don't think is a great fit for this team, just because I don't like he's good. He's going to be good to take in small ball lineups as a small ball 5, but his best role has been kind of as a defensive 4 and positional versatility as a defensive 4 that could switch and then play small ball 5. The 4 part of that is really hard with this roster. Like, there's not a lot of room for him to get on the floor there. And then in terms of Jared Vanderbilt, I think one of the reasons he could potentially be the answer is some of the defensive skills that he has really help. And with the size of Luka and LeBron, in terms of being able to help rebound and defensive rebound, some of the issues that Jared Vanderbilt would have as playing as a true center are perhaps masked by having that bulk size as a unit to defensive rebound there. And then hopefully Jared Vanderbilt, who hasn't been used this way a lot, but could be used more as a roll man instead of just in the dunker spot. If he can be used as a roll man effectively, Luka can elevate him offensively. So I think that's the path ultimately to potentially get here, but it's going to be shaky. It's going to take time to integrate and figure out kind of rhythm. We've seen this with all ranges of star players before. Remember, LeBron James, Dwayne Wade, and Chris Bosh got together, and in their first 17 games, they were 9-8 together before they absolutely blew away the league. So it's going to take some time to fit here. The Lakers have worked themselves up to 5th place in the Western Conference, 32-20 here going into the break. Saum, ultimately, where do you think they finish out from a seeding perspective? Right now, they're 2 games in the loss column back of Memphis, who's up at the 2nd seed, and they're currently 5 games in the loss column ahead of the 7th seed Minnesota Timberwolves. Where ultimately do you think the Lakers finish from a seeding perspective when we head into the playoffs?
Yeah, I mean, they got to feel pretty good about the position they're in now, and I think assuming they stay relatively healthy, they'll be able to stick in that top 6 and avoid the play-in. I think ideally they're able to find spots for LeBron with rest coming up, so I don't think they're going to necessarily be gunning for the top 3 or 4. But I feel pretty good they'll be able to hold their seeding as it is, and we're going to talk about some other teams behind them that not too optimistic on. So I feel pretty good about where they are, and I'm expecting them to assuming everything stayed relatively healthy and all, they'll stick around that 5 seed that they are now.
Yep. And we'll get to the Mavs side of this trade as well in a bit, but let's move to Jimmy Butler and the Golden State Warriors. We've seen 3 games for Jimmy and the Warriors, and it's been a mixed bag. It got off to a really rough start in the first half of the first game against Chicago, where Golden State was getting blown out by the Bulls. They ended up reversing course in that game in a big way and taking control in the second half and ended up blowing out Chicago. Then they had a nice win at Milwaukee, playing kind of a shorthanded Milwaukee squad without Giannis Antetokounmpo. Then they get a Dallas team without Anthony Davis. They end up losing that game in kind of a close game towards the end. So they've been on the road here. So going 2-1 on the road is never a bad thing, but the competition has been a little bit watered down. Jimmy, the production's been great. 22 points, 6.7 rebounds, 5.7 assists, 1.7 steals, zero point 0.7 blocks. This looks like the Jimmy Butler lines that we had seen kind of before all of the frustration that he had with Miami this season. So, what have the early returns from Jimmy Butler in Golden State looked like to you?
Absolutely. I think if you're Golden State, you got to be pretty encouraged by this from the limited time we've seen, and even the loss last night where they make a really valiant comeback in the second half, and I thought they were going to take it. I mean, they took the lead with a few minutes left, but then Dallas was able to hang on, and we'll get into there. They needed that one, but yeah, I think this is what they're really looking for, and. What stuck out to me too is just how much he's getting to the free throw line and giving them that, someone who can get any kind of rim pressure right now. And especially while Jonathan Kuminga is out, they just had really nothing else of a real threat on offense aside from Curry. And you're just seeing already the load he can take off of him and possessions that Curry doesn't. Everything doesn't have to revolve around him. He can just get to the basket, get a couple free throws, some easy buckets. So I think you're really encouraged if you're Golden State right now. And one thing we've also seen from Kerr, and we were talking about it from projections, is they seem to kind of be zeroing in on like a solidified rotation rather than these 12 mans where everyone's kind of getting in there. And they flipped the starting lineup again last game, but at halftime, they went back to their smaller lineup with Draymond center, and I think that's probably where this is heading. Is Draymond starting at the 5 and them going from there? So I think I'd be pretty encouraged so far from what you've seen from Golden State with Jimmy.
Yeah, and I think there's a couple different things that you would immediately reference. So one is Steph, even in post game commentary, has said like things just aren't as hard. Every offensive possession just isn't as difficult as it kind of was before. Even when they're bringing kind of extra attention towards Steph, there's an outlet now with Jimmy that is different than the outlet with Dre. Right. The outlet with Dre in the past is like try to find the next person that can put pressure on the defense. The outlet with Jimmy is he's immediately putting pressure on the defense. He's had a lot of success as kind of a roll man after screeners, which is an interesting twist in the way that they're using. I think a motion based offense that's kind of 5 out is perfect for Jimmy Butler because he's so good at moving off the ball. He's so good at kind of finding seams. He reminds me in a lot of ways, if you want to do kind of a football crossover, of like Travis Kelce, where he just his ability to sort of innovate on what the defense is giving you and feel out zones and feel out spots to be able to attack is very strong. And I think that paired with this motion-based offense will be very, very effective. He's also a great distributor. We've seen 5.7 assists per game in the first 3 games. And as you mentioned, 11 free throw attempts per game. That's a huge amount of free points that this team was unable to get before. So everything should be getting a little bit easier offensively. I think it'll be interesting to see how they incorporate Kuminga into the mix down the road. Kuminga is a player that if you can get Kuminga to just be focusing on trying to put pressure on the rim without using the dribble, with using his athleticism, with using his cutting and different things, Jimmy's a guy that can take advantage of that. And there's more room, like Dre is a guy that can take advantage of that, but defenses can play Dre to pass. When Jimmy's the outlet, you can't play Jimmy to pass because he will eat up space and take it and use it offensively. So I think there's a little bit more dynamic approach to their offense, having Jimmy Butler in some of these release valve areas. And then Draymond Green can be kind of a secondary release valve that once he gets in the ball, he immediately turns into these dribble handoffs that Steph is so good coming off of and getting and creating space for. Ultimately, they haven't gotten a lot of production from Buddy Hield. I think they could still use better shooting and more production from Buddy Hield. That's kind of the thing that would really turn them up a notch. But in these first 3 games, it's a small sample size, but they've been like a top 10 offense and just outside of the top 10 defense. So I think a very encouraging start for Golden State. We look at where they're at in the standings right now, currently sitting in 10th place. They have a game tonight. That'll be the second night of back-to-back. Regardless of the results there, they will head into the break in 10th place in the Western Conference. So in the play-in, but kind of on the edge. There'll be 2 to 3 games in the loss column behind Minnesota, 4 to 5 games in the loss column behind the Clippers of getting out of the play-in. Where ultimately do you see Golden State landing?
Yeah, I mean, that you're talking about that loss yesterday. That would have been huge for them, especially to get that leg up on Dallas. But look, I think now we can say pretty much they'll be in the mix for the end of the play. And where before this trade, and like you were saying, this more than anything just gives hope because it just seemed like they were just well on their way to falling out of the play and just entirely the way they play. And you're talking about the Curry quotes and everything before this trade. I mean, it just seems so dire, right? It just seemed like no passion. We'd see him on the bench with a towel on his head, and now at least something to look forward to. So I expect him to stay, in the mix for the play-in, and I like their chances because not necessarily how optimistic I am on them, although I do like this trade and what it's been giving them, but more pessimism about what's around them currently. So I like their chances of mixing the play-in. And look, when you got Steph and Jimmy, I mean, you're giving yourself a chance always. So a lot to be encouraged about, and very limited sample, but I think that you got to be happy with what you've seen.
Yeah, I mean, the challenge ultimately here will be they're in the 10th spot right now. If you're in the ninth or 10th spot, right, you have to win 2 consecutive games to get into the playoffs, and then you're playing the OKC Thunder. So, like, the goal for every team in the Western Conference that is competing in the play-in, obviously, first and foremost, you just want to get in. But really, what you want to do is you want to get to that 7 or 8 spot to potentially be able to get to the 7th spot, where in the second seed it's an array of teams that you could potentially play. It could be Memphis, it could be Denver, it could be Houston, it could be the Lakers that potentially creep up there. Maybe if the Clippers get hot, they could creep up there. But ultimately, I think teams want to be able to avoid Oklahoma City in the first round, and so Golden State's going to need to clear 2 of Sacramento, Dallas, Minnesota to have the opportunity to do so. I think this team is really interesting the way that they're constructed now for a postseason, but getting into the postseason is a challenge because of the hole that they've dug themselves. And obviously, keeping these guys healthy, this veteran laden team, throughout the rest of the second half of the season will also be challenging for Golden State. But I'm very encouraged by the early returns on this. And I do think that as we look ahead to next year with Jimmy under contract for next year as well, I do think there's some reason for optimism of the back end of Steph's window that wasn't here before the trade. And so I think, Golden State flipped things a little bit, pending that Jimmy will, be playing the way that he's played these last 3 games next year as well. Obviously, with Jimmy, it's always to be determined. But let's move over to the San Antonio Spurs, who have fallen outside of the play-in now to 23 and 29. They're in 12th place in the Western Conference. They've had a little bit of a longer look with De'Aaron Fox so far. He's played 5 games with them. They've all been on the road, so he hasn't had a home game just yet at this point. 2 and 3 on the road, and honestly, a little bit disappointing in terms of the results. Their 2 wins at Atlanta was a very nice win. And then at Washington, their losses here at Boston, totally understandable, but at Orlando and at Charlotte, disappointing 1-point losses. The first 3 games they played with De'Aaron Fox were all 1-point games. So to get the clutch player right in time for the 1-point games, certainly nice. But what have been your early looks here at De'Aaron Fox in the new system in San Antonio?
Yeah, like I said, we got a little more of a sample size here than we have on some of the other situations we'll get to. And Fox has been fine. I think he's played well. He's in his minutes. Mixed results so far. I think what's been most interesting to me on the whole is how the rotation has gone since Fox is there. Where my assumption was Chris Paul was going to go to the bench with him, but what they've been doing is they've been starting. Fox and CP3 together with Castle coming off the bench, and CP3's minutes haven't taken a hit at all. He's still getting near 30 every game, and it's really been the back end guys who have been hurt the most, and Sohan and Keldon in particular, where their minutes are really cut down. And I'm not really sure this is what the lineups and rotations should be long term. I really think they need it. I mean, Castle he's been probably the biggest story of out of these 5 games more than anything is how awesome Castle has been off the bench, and he's getting a little blocked by CP3 right now, which I'm not really sure about. I'd like to see them get more Castle in there, and maybe CP3 is just more, handling that second unit. But I think nothing big, particularly from the Fox Wemby combo. I think they've looked fine. We've seen a couple wins, but I just think the rotation as a whole, I'd like to see them get Castle more with that first unit, and then maybe, and Sohan and Keldon have been pretty good for them too. So I'm curious to see how the rotation plays out as they get more looks with this current team.
Yeah, it's interesting. Kind of what they've been running a lot on their offense right now has been like sort of Chris Paul bringing the ball up, and then they'll get into situations where they kind of run a pick and roll with Wemby to see if they can kind of get anything immediately there. If not, they kind of just circle back out to getting Wemby the ball and then going right into a dribble handoff into a pick and roll with De'Aaron Fox. And so they're using De'Aaron Fox as a little bit more of kind of a secondary creator here early on. He's obviously had to, do some of that role in Sacramento, playing alongside Malik Monk. He's also very accustomed to the dribble handoff game with Domantas Sabonis. That's been very effective in Sacramento as well. So I think they're trying to incorporate some of the things that De'Aaron Fox has been more comfortable with. But the rotation has been a little clunky. A couple things that have happened. Removing Stephen Castle from the starting lineup has created a little bit of a void against opposing lead guards. We've seen lead guards have a lot more success offensively, being able to attack the combination of CP3 and De'Aaron Fox. I think De'Aaron Fox, anytime these guys move to new places, the defense is going to take a little bit of time to catch up, simply because they're learning the new system. They're learning how to communicate with new players that they haven't communicated with. So it's all like, it all takes a little bit of time. But that rotation that they've chosen with Chris Paul, which I think is in part because they want to, you know, veteran deference in terms of Chris Paul and the contributions he's made to the team this year, in part because I think they're also trying to like give it's a condensed schedule this time of the year. They have not a lot of practice time. De'Aaron Fox probably doesn't know all the sets at this point in time. They're probably just trying to get like, hey, just learn these couple things that we're going to work off of, and then you can play from there. And we're going to let Chris kind of navigate all the other things. So I think there's some of that. It has been encouraging to see how much Stephen Castle has thrived in the second unit and thrived with kind of a lead usage role. But what they have certainly lost in that mix is some of the organization in that second unit. And that's where guys like Keldon Johnson, Jeremy Sohan, who have been successful before, are kind of falling by the wayside, because Stephen Castle's doing a lot of more of his own individual creating for himself, but he's not a point guard. I know he wanted to be a point guard coming out of the draft, but that wasn't really his niche, and he's not really creating for other people. I think in the past they've had the staggers between Chris Paul or Devin Vassell, and Devin Vassell a little bit more in that facilitator role. So I think they're figuring out the rotations and how things can go from here. Obviously, when this trade was made, it was not made with this year in mind in particular, but it has been a little bit disappointing for them to go 2-3 during the stretch on the road here, fall a little bit further out now, 2 games behind the loss on Golden State. Obviously, Golden State gets a little bit better at the deadline as well. So any hopes of maybe sneaking Wemby into the play-in have certainly been dashed a little bit more here over the last few games. Ultimately, though, I think there's still a lot to be determined on how this trade looks for San Antonio and for the future. And I mean, I think the fact that Fox, we kind of know what Fox is. Stephen Castle has continued to show improved development. His 3-point shots continue to develop. His scoring roles continue to develop. We thought basically Stephen Castle was going to be a connector offensively and a really high-end defensive player in his prime. He's showing the ability to be more than just a connector offensively so far. I think those are all positives. And they didn't, give up the Hawks picks in these. So the future is very, very bright for San Antonio here, even if it's been a little bit dim over these last 5 games. Any other notes there on San Antonio, Saum?
No, I just agree with everything you're saying. And yeah, like you said, this move too is more with the, future looking way. But look, I think still, like you said, there are only a few losses out, to get that, to sneak into the play-in, maybe make some noise. But like I said, I think the team now, even with Castle's ascension and everything, a lot to be looking forward to. But as far as this season, I think I wouldn't bet on them probably to make the play-in, but there's a chance. But I think really everything from here is forward looking, and we'll see with those rotation notes how after the All-Star break maybe they make some changes too.
Yeah, let's stick with some of these Western Conference play-in contenders and some of the deals that they made around the deadline. Let's go to Dallas. And unfortunately, all we saw from Anthony Davis was one game before a re-aggravation of this abdominal injury that he's been dealing with. That one game, and especially that first half of basketball, was about as good as you probably could have envisioned things going for the Dallas Mavericks. They end up winning, kind of going away against Houston, 116-105 in Anthony Davis's debut, and he puts up 26, 16, 7 assists, 3 blocks, and is utterly dominant throughout much of the first half of the game. Did slow down a little bit at the second half, and then ultimately left the game due to injury. As a Lakers fan, you've seen a lot of Anthony Davis over the last few years and paid a lot of close attention to his game. What did you see in that debut with Washington, where he was paired with Daniel Gafford and PJ Washington in a very, very big front court? And he was very dominant on both sides of the ball in that huge front court.
Yeah, I mean, Anthony Davis just has a way, like, so unique, where he can just really just take over a game. And you saw it, especially in that first half on that game. And obviously a lot of anticipation of that game after that trade and all. And, we were wondering that game too, where that was Anthony Davis's first game in a few weeks. He had been coming off injured. We thought maybe limited. No, they went full blast, no limits at all. Kid was committed to, playing him there. And, we can talk about whether it had anything to do with the injury or not. But yeah, you've seen what the ceiling of Anthony Davis can be and what he can bring to a team. I'm not sure. I think it's a mixed bag considering he's out indefinitely now. It sounds like he'll be able to avoid surgery, but we really don't have a return timeline. But hey, when AD is healthy, I mean, I don't think that the trade should take anything away from him. I mean, the entire season he stayed relatively healthy. He's been extremely dominant, and we talk about a big part of why the Lakers are in a good position they are right now is because of the play of Anthony Davis. So hopefully he can get healthy and we can see what a healthy Mavs team looks like and like their vision. But to this point, we haven't seen it just with all the injuries they're dealing with right now.
Yeah, it's been unfortunate. Not only does Anthony Davis leave that game with an injury, Daniel Gafford leaves the next game with an injury. And so they've just struggled to stay healthy. And PJ Washington has been out. So they have not had Anthony Davis, PJ Washington, Daniel Gafford, or Derek Lively. Those are the four front court players that they're really expecting to have in their ultimate iteration here. They're doing a good job at kind of like holding on here. They lost a real tough game to the Kings ultimately, but then they get a nice bounce back win against Golden State. So going 2-1 here since the Anthony Davis's debut, and they got a road win in Boston too before this. So they've responded to the Luka trade pretty well so far in terms of where they're at in the standings currently, sitting at 8th place, 29-26, kind of going into the break here. They do play again today, so we'll see. One more game of them before the All-Star break here. But I think the ultimate vision from Nico Harrison, of Anthony Davis sort of dominating on both ends and them being a team that's going to be really difficult to score on and really difficult to play in transition against. I think we saw that all in that first half against Houston. So I think it was very encouraging from that perspective. The concerns about Anthony Davis's health are obviously significant given that he was coming off of an injury. He's injured now. He had been very healthy for the last year and a half. I think the immediate forecast for this Mavericks team was still pretty optimistic. Like trading Luka Doncic for Anthony Davis for this season probably isn't giving up a ton of value. Most of the value that we're concerned about it giving up from Dallas' side is the long-term value, years 2, 3, 4, as you get further up into the 30s for Anthony Davis. But I thought the first half was great. I will say, though, Houston responded by going double big themselves, and Anthony Davis started to have his impact a little bit more muted. And that's one of the things that I do wonder about is if other teams are able to play big, will that ultimately sort of nullify some of the advantages that the Mavericks are intending to get by playing big with Anthony Davis at the 4? Because in the first half of that game, they looked great. In the second half of that game, it looked like they had a little bit of harder time controlling the boards, allowed Houston to kind of get out in transition and do the things that Houston likes to do. So that's the thing that when we get Anthony Davis back, I'm ultimately like kind of interested to see here. But again, in the same breadth that we're talking about for Golden State here, in terms of being stuck in this play-in and where you're at currently and the realities of the situation, is if Dallas made this trade to improve their chances at being a great team this year, they're doing that from a position of weakness, meaning that they're in the play-in currently. They need to get out of the play-in, then they need to get out of the play-in and take on a very top-tier team in the first round of the playoffs. And so the path to a lot of success here is going to be very challenging. I know they've had a lot of success against Oklahoma City. They feel very comfortable in that matchup, perhaps more comfortable than anybody else in the league in that matchup. But I think that's ultimately going to be a big concern. And then with Anthony Davis's indefinite timeline, Daniel Gafford banged up, Derek Lively is still out for months. You do wonder if they're going to be able to maintain the positioning that they're in. That overtime loss to Sacramento was really tough because that's a team that they're competing with right here. But ultimately, like, can they stay in that 7-8 mark? It's going to be tough to get into the 6 and above that because the Clippers look like they're righting the ship, and obviously the Lakers and Rockets and Nuggets are meaningfully ahead in the standings. Where do you think we ultimately see Dallas fall when the playoffs come?
Yeah, I think a lot of it's just going to come down to their health, right? And I'm assuming if they start getting a little healthier, I think they're good enough. They're going to stay. I think they could probably avoid the 9-10 seed, assuming they get most of their guys back. And just on the trade too, got to give a shout out to Max Christie, who's been
Yeah.
available for all these games in the 5, and he's just been awesome. Kid's playing him a ton already. He got his first start last game, played almost 40 minutes. He scored 15 in each one. He's giving them good defense, good energy. So while obviously it's tough for the Mavs right now losing Anthony Davis and all, Christie has given them something to look forward to and be rooting for. And his growth is going to be exciting to continue to see. And he's on a great contract too. He's just entering the first year of his extension, which in this new CBA world, contracts like that can be really valuable. So wow, yeah, definitely, certainly tough on that front. Max Christie has given him a lot to be excited for at the moment.
Yeah, he's been fantastic, and obviously we've seen 5 games now with Max Christie with the Mavericks, and he's scored 15 or more points in each of those 5 games. Played 30 or more minutes in each of those 5 games. Been a positive influence on the defensive side of the ball, and a little bit of playmaking. 3 or 4 assists in 4 of the 5 games. So it's kind of all around contributions from Max Christie, really growing in a way that's really impressive. Just 22 years old, as Klay Thompson and many of us also learned, not the son of Doug Christie, but Max Christie, Michigan State product, doing really really well in his debut and easing some of the burn from the Luka Doncic trade for Mavs fans. I'm sure not much, but easing a little bit there. Let's talk about the Kings. They make the acquisition for Zach LaVine. Obviously, they send out De'Aaron Fox to kind of meet his trade demands and his request there. Zach LaVine, so far, as a Sacramento King, we've seen him play 5 games with the Kings. It's been a little bit slow on the starting front, shooting just 41% from the field, 20.5% from three, averaging 19 points, 3 boards, 4 assists. The Kings have gone 2-3. They have won 3 in a row here. That nice overtime win against Dallas, sandwiched between 2 wins against the Pelicans. What have you seen from Zach LaVine and the Kings so far?
Yeah, we've seen Zach LaVine. I mean, he was just awesome getting all the usage in Chicago, and that's been tamed a little bit, just entering that Kings starting lineup with a lot of usage. But reminds me a lot of the Kings teams we've seen, really the last few years, right? Where the offenses have been great. They've been scoring a ton, a lot of deficiencies on defense, and I think this is just they're gonna hang around in the play-in. Maybe they'll be able to sneak in for that 9-10 seed, but wouldn't expect basically anything about that. So I would say returns have been encouraging. I think he's been good. He's done his job, but I think a lot of people kind of know the story of what this team is and what they're destined for. So it's hard to have a really big opinion on that. But I think they got to be pretty pleased with what he's brought to the table so far.
Yeah, I mean, with Zach, the thing that you're gonna get a lot of minutes. You're gonna get the offense. So far, the efficiency hasn't been there. He shot just 20% from three. Once that turns around, I think they could be more optimistic about kind of the results that they've gotten. I think the concerns and the question marks is still kind of the roster build as a whole. Is like, how far can you get with Domantas Sabonis as your big? What kind of defenders do you need to build around Domantas Sabonis? That they're certainly not Malik Monk, Zach LaVine, DeMar DeRozan are not known to be defenders. So the guys that you have on your roster that are potentially defenders, and they just signed Markel Fultz, another guy that's not really known as a great defender. Keon Ellis, how much are they going to be able to play Keon Ellis? Are they going to emphasize him? It comes and goes with their interest in kind of emphasizing Keon Ellis, but I think he needs to play more, and I think Keegan Murray needs to be a defensive anchor for them because they just don't have much on the defensive side. And ultimately, like, can they get enough offense? Maybe to survive a play-in, possibly. I'm not super optimistic. I do think they have a nice home court advantage. They do have, a nice team in terms of it being a team that very durable guys, Sabonis, DeRozan, Monk, super, super durable guys. So you know what you're getting out there each and every night. But not a team that can play a lot of different ways right now, and not a team that has a lot of defense. So in the playoffs, those are two things that usually mean falling short. And so I think the Kings are just sort of tapped out in terms of ceiling right now. And I think the trade kind of kept him in this range. And I'd be more interested if I were a Kings fan in seeing if they could elevate the ceiling by getting more out of Keon Ellis. That's the guy that I think is really intriguing as a young, cheap player to continue to get more looks at. Last team in the West to take a look at before we peek at a few Eastern Conference teams, the Phoenix Suns. We talked a lot about them as a big loser at the trade deadline. Obviously, they were unable to move off of the Bradley Beal contract. They were unable to add significantly to the roster. They got Cody Martin, Vasilij Micic, and Nick Richards. The returns on those deals have been mixed to start. They've also had some injury issues that they've been dealing with Bradley Beal out, with Kevin Durant out, then Devin Booker out. So since the trade deadline here, they've gone 1-3 with their one win, an overtime win at home against Utah. Not a particularly compelling win. That's their only win in their last 7 games in total here. So they are kind of free falling down the standings. We've seen Bull kind of get resurrected here in part at the expense of Nick Richards, the player that they kind of traded to kind of elevate here. So it feels like just constantly rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic here for the Phoenix Suns. What are your thoughts on what we've seen early on from the Suns? We haven't seen very much from Micic or Cody Martin at this point, but what are your thoughts on early returns from the Suns trade deadline?
Yeah, I think your point of just kind of rearranging chairs just tells us the whole story of the Suns, right? And even since that Nick Richards trade, where you thought, oh, okay, maybe things are more consistent. No, it's a lot like the past Suns teams we've seen, and the last couple games really tell the story, right? Like you're saying, they throw Bull in the starting lineup, maybe give him something. And credit to him, that first game he was really great, but still we've seen it. I mean, they have to play Kevin Durant over 40 minutes in both legs of these back to backs, and it's still not enough. You said Micic was available for his first game. Last game they play Colin Gillespie and Ty Washington over him. Um, it's just, yeah, like you're saying, it's just a team that I don't really think they even know what the rotation is or who their best guys are. And going to All Star break, I mean, there's just really not a lot to be optimistic about on this team now. We thought maybe the trade deadline they'd be able to pull some things together, but the early returns on the Nick Richards trade have been very mixed, mostly not great. I mean, that first game he was awesome. He had like a 20-10 game, and since then he's not even getting to 20 minutes some games. It's been tough for the Suns, and like you're saying, they're free falling down the standings, and it's really hard to paint a vision of optimism of how they get this thing into gear and right the ship, because I don't see the way, and I'm not sure they do either.
Yeah, the optimistic version that they've continued to try to pitch is that when they have Bradley Beal and Devin Booker and Kevin Durant all together, that they've been a winning team and that they've been effective. We just don't see much of it together, and the reason we haven't seen much of it together is veteran players later part of their careers, but also the reliance that this team has on these three players from a minutes perspective, from an offensive usage perspective, to kind of carry everything. And some of the acquisitions that they made in the offseason that we were very excited about in terms of Tyus Jones, Royce O'Neal, in terms of building out and hoping to solidify that depth, it hasn't come to fruition. They've still had a hard time. The NBA season is a long season to get through from an injury perspective, and they've had a hard time kind of finding consistency and getting through it. So they've slipped to the 11th spot now, one game back in the loss column with the Golden State Warriors. I would say that if I was making odds for them to be in the play-in, I'd make them an underdog at this point to get into the play-in. I think the hope is ultimately that maybe they can surpass the Sacramento Kings. Maybe the Kings run into some challenges. Maybe the Warriors, if Steph or Jimmy are deal with some sort of injury, the Warriors would be vulnerable. But I think it's even like the Mavs who are dealing with a lot of injuries. I think the Mavs are still in a better position to kind of hold on than the Suns at this point. Any thoughts on where we ultimately see the Suns end up come playoff time?
Yeah, I'd agree with you. I think they're probably a dog to even make the play in at this point. And look, even if they do, like, it's clear they're just gonna have to ride these main guys the entire way there. And these 40-minute Durant games, I mean, by the time they even get, if they did make the play in or playoffs, like, these guys should be exhausted. And we saw a lot of that in the playoffs last year when they got swept by Minnesota. So a real uphill climb here. We'll see. I think they just, these secondary guys, where even Ryan Dunn at the beginning of the season, he was looking like a real big hit, and we've seen him really fall off. He really can't play a ton of minutes now. So it kind of goes back to what we were saying at the beginning of this, where this rotation right now is that they don't even really know what it's looking like. So very pessimistic going forward. I think if their main guys stay healthy, they can probably sneak in there. But even then, I mean, I feel like what's the ceiling? What does it pass, even if they make it? So tough times for the Phoenix Suns.
All right, let's go to the Eastern Conference. Just a couple trades to talk through in terms of their impact on contending teams. We'll start with Kyle Kuzma and the Milwaukee Bucks. Since Kuzma's been acquired by the Bucks, he's played in 4 games. They've split those 4 games. They've played all of those games, I believe all of them without Giannis Antetokounmpo. Maybe they had Giannis for one of those games, but he's been hurt. They played the last game without Damian Lillard at this point, so it hasn't been the full kind of version of the Bucks. So it's kind of difficult to evaluate. But what we've seen from Kyle Kuzma so far since the acquisition is more of the same of what we saw from Kyle Kuzma kind of in Washington. Inefficient shot volume has certainly been there, but he hasn't shot the ball particularly well so far. Not from 3 as well. He's just 4 for 18 from 3 to start his Bucks tenure here. He rebounds the ball, a little bit of playmaking on the assist side of things, but in a lot of ways, some like kind of empty minutes, and he's taken some minutes from Bobby Portis at this point. They did get a really nice road win in Minnesota last night when they were really shorthanded here without Dame and Giannis. That's an awesome win for a Bucks team that is kind of floating around the middle of the Eastern Conference right now, and what has become like a clear top 3 and then a clear next 3 before you get into kind of the play-in teams here. They're in that clear next 3 and kind of floating around between the 4 and the 6 seed. But what have your thoughts on the early returns here for Kyle Kuzma?
Yeah, like you said, hard to make take a ton, because we still haven't seen Giannis in there with them. But yeah, it's just been, I would say, kind of what I was expecting, really, where, a lot of empty offense in a way. But, one thing I will say is, and, Mike was talking about this a little bit on the initial trade reaction pods, is I think for the regular season wise, we saw kind of yesterday why I think in part, they want to make this trade where, Giannis and Dame are out, and Kyle Kuzma can play almost 40 minutes and just, give them some usage and anything, and they get a nice road win where, Mike was talking maybe the regular season, their ceiling's a little bit, if it takes a little bit off of the playoffs. So I don't have a ton to take from, but I think just the fact that you can rely on Kuzma to just, give you a lot of minutes in that regular season, especially where we've seen Giannis and Dame really, take on big minutes. Maybe he can take a usage, workload off them in some minutes. So you got to be, I guess, somewhat encouraged. I mean, hopefully the shooting can get back to where we've seen previous seasons, because this entire season has not been there. But yeah, I mean, split a couple games. We'll see when Giannis is back what this ultimately is going to look like.
Yeah, I think perhaps the most optimistic view, as you alluded to there, and Mike had mentioned before, is just like a lot of the teams in the Eastern Conference that you're going to play are bad enough that if you can just have somebody to kind of hold the line while Giannis or Dame needs some time out, that Kyle Kuzma is the guy who can soak up minutes. And that looks like the most optimistic point. Obviously, getting a road win in Minnesota is better than just that. But they're going to play teams like Washington, Charlotte, Toronto, that are lesser teams that if they can just kind of hold the line, stay away from the play-in, and make sure that Giannis and Dame are 100%. Giannis going to miss another week after the All-Star break with the issue that he's dealing with currently, and they've made clear that Giannis is very aware he hasn't been able to play in the last two playoffs, and that's a big reason that they've struggled. Last team to talk through here, DeAndre Hunter with the Cleveland Cavaliers. DeAndre Hunter's played 2 games with the Cavs. They've won both games by 20 plus points. It's been kind of more what we've seen from the Cavs during the course of the year. They blew out Minnesota at home. They go to Toronto. They blow out them in Toronto. Hunter himself has played fine. 12 points, 1 board, 0 assists in 23 minutes in the first game, got into a little bit of foul trouble, and then 18 points, 5 boards, 1 steal in the second game. What are your notes on the initial returns for DeAndre Hunter here?
Yeah, and another team where, like, so that first game, Strus was out, so he gets the start, limited by some foul trouble, but was fine. And then that second game, Ty Jerome was out, and they still haven't been without Dean Wade these few games. But yeah, Cavs have been doing more of the same what they've been doing all season, crushing teams in the 2 games, and just what Hunter gives them is just more versatility, I guess I would say, for that rotation. Where Ty Jerome has just been so awesome this year. It's really taken on a lot of what they would need Karras to do. And now at that wing position, you have just so much versatility. And if you need that defense, Dean Wade, when he's eventually back, you throw him in. When you need some more offense, Hunter's there. You still got Strus. So a lot of what when the trade happened, of what we thought and what it would give them, I think we're already seeing it. And as they continue to get healthier and see at full strength, I'd be curious to see how they kind of work them into the rotation and different matchups.
Yeah, and they've played well defensively in the first 2 games that he's been there, allowing just 107 and 108 points. Obviously, like, it's really small samples with everything that we're evaluating here, but I think earlier turns on the DeAndre Hunter trade looks like exactly kind of what we were expecting, and provide kind of a better matchup to deal with the Boston Celtics, which is obviously where Cleveland's eyes are focused on as we head into the playoffs. All right. That'll do it for this edition of Established Run's NBA podcast. A couple programming related notes as we head into the All-Star break here. Want to thank Saum Jafarinia for joining us today. You will hear more from Saum over the upcoming weeks. Mike Gallagher will be back from vacation next week to be able to do an edition of this podcast. I'm going to be taking some time off. Those of you who subscribe to our DFS products may have heard, but my wife is 8 months pregnant, and as we anticipate the birth of our first child, I'm going to be taking some time off, and especially from content, so I don't get caught in a position that I'm kind of caught up in the air in the middle of a segment where I need to go to the hospital. So we're going to be working behind the scenes on the projection stuff until my wife goes into labor, and then I'll take some time off after that, and I'll come back probably around the playoffs to talk through things. So you'll see more of Saum, more of some other members of our team alongside Mike Gallagher on this podcast feed going forward. But for those of you that are listening on iTunes, Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts, appreciate you leaving us a rating and review. That helps give us feedback on how to create this content for you, and helps get the eyes and ears on more of this content across the industry. If you're interested in checking out the video versions of this podcast, you can go to Established Run NBA on YouTube. And if you're interested in checking out any of our premium products, you can go to establishedrun.com/NBA-subscribe for more details on our premium product offerings, either on the props or on the DFS side of things. Really proud of all the work that we're doing over there. So it'll be a little bit of time until you hear my voice again. I look forward to the break and look forward to connecting with you guys as the playoffs ramp up. The second half of the season should be a lot of fun. Saum, thank you for joining us today. And we will see all of you next time on the Established Run NBA podcast.